Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the 2013 MacBook Pro and see how this MacBook holds up in 2022. Now, I've actually owned a few different 2013 models. I went and bought one back in the day. I didn't use it. I ended up reselling it, and then I ended up actually buying a 2014 one to use on an everyday basis. But since then, I've bought a few other 2013 MacBook Pros. I did have a 13-inch one that I've used primarily. I never had the 15-inch one, but I've owned several other 15-inch models. But with the 13-inch one, I love these types of MacBooks. They were really good. They were in a small form factor, and this was actually coming right after the big redesign that we had from the 2012 Retina MacBook Pro. Now, with these MacBook Pros, keep in mind, this is that standard one with the Retina display and everything. Some people actually prefer that thicker one with the 2008 unibody MacBook Pro that kept getting redesigned. And that one was a really good MacBook too. It was, you could take it apart and upgrade a ton of different things, but you could also upgrade a ton of different things within this MacBook Pro, especially more than what we can do on our M1 Pro MacBooks. Now, on the outside, I will definitely tell you, this is a really good looking MacBook, and Apple has done a great job at just, making their devices feel so future proofed. You can still pick up a 2008 MacBook Pro, the standard one, and that thing still feels very premium. That does not feel like a cheap MacBook whatsoever. With this type of MacBook, it's the same exact case. This is approaching 10 years old right now, which is crazy. It's almost 10 years old, but this thing doesn't feel like a 10-year-old MacBook. When I hold this thing and I compare it even against my M1 Pro MacBook, there really isn't that big of a difference. There's differences for sure, but Apple has actually brought back a lot of these older MacBook peripherals to these new MacBooks, which is so amazing to see. Now, on the outside, on the front, we do have that aluminum top with that Apple logo. That Apple logo is still persistent on pretty much every single MacBook that's been placed after that, but it's a glowing logo, which is something we don't have nowadays. When it first came out, I think a lot of people were happy about it, but then they took it out with the 2016 ones, and many people were upset about it. I, for one, I'm kind of in the middle. I'm not really looking at the back of my MacBook too much, but it's still nice to have one of those type of glowing logos on your type of MacBook. Now, on top of that, the screen itself on the back, it was very thin, so it didn't really look super thick when you had it open either. And you have to remember, 2013, there were probably a lot of MacBooks at this time that actually there were a lot of laptops at this time that probably didn't look as good as this thing. Yeah, maybe nowadays this design may be a little tiny bit dated, but it really isn't, honestly. This thing still looks very premium, and it still looks like a piece of art, to be honest. Now, on the one side of this MacBook, we had that MagSafe charger, we had two Thunderbolt 2 ports, a USB 3 port, a headphone jack, and essentially we also had the microphone dual mic array, whatever they want to call it. Now, I want to pause right there. Yeah, that, IO selection may be a little bit dated. We don't really have Thunderbolt ports. We have, USB Type-C ports with Thunderbolt built in, but the MagSafe charger ended up getting brought back, and we also now have the same type of setup like this on our M1 MacBook Pros, the Pro MacBooks, if you will. We have the one USB port on one side, we have two USB ports on the other with an SD card. And this MacBook at least had MagSafe on it, which the new MacBooks have. Apple brought it back, and that's another really cool thing that Apple actually ended up doing. Now, on the other side, this is where things get even crazier. We had another USB port, which was cool, an HDMI port, and an SD card slot. Now, the reason why this type of design of these MacBooks is so crazy is because Apple ended up bringing back pretty much all those types of IOs to this specific MacBook, the M1 Pro MacBooks, the 14-inch and 16-inch ones. So much so, in fact, they not only brought back the SD card, which was crazy, but they brought back that HDMI port, which was also insane. The fact that they did those two things is pretty crazy in my opinion, and I'm also so happy. Anytime I think about this, I'm just so happy they went down in that direction, because it really kind of future-proofed not only the new M1 Pro MacBooks, but these 2013 MacBooks as well. Apple did a tremendous job with this type of design, and it stemmed from the 2012 one, but I'm also so happy they brought it back with these type of MacBooks. Now, opening this thing up, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So you can either get the 13-inch one with the 13-inch display, or that 15-inch MacBook. Personally, like I mentioned, I did have that 13-inch one, and I did kind of prefer this over the 15-inch one, although I did use a 15-inch MacBook Pro as my main one for a long period of time. But I still say, with this type of MacBook, you have that option. If you want that cheaper one, go for the cheaper one. If you want a higher end one, then go for the 15-inch one. That's just kind of the way it goes. Now, when this thing is open, there's a few things I want to say. The display is still very beautiful. it doesn't really feel like a dated display. There are some ways that it doesn't feel as, new as some newer MacBook displays. For one, there's a little bit of a thicker bezel design on these type of MacBooks than the newest ones, but also we do have True Tone. We have some other things that kind of warm and make the display look so much better. These types of panels, you can always go ahead and kind of mess around with the color profiles, but I do kind of like that with the, newer displays. And also we do have ProMotion on our MacBook Pro displays now, where the old ones like this one don't really have that type of capability either. So there's a little bit of give and take, but again, for the price tag you'll end up probably paying for this thing, it's really not that big of a deal in my opinion. And you have that standard size keyboard on the bottom. Now this was another really big asset for this type of keyboard, because a lot of people hated the 2016 to 2020 MacBook Pro keyboards, and even the standard MacBook and even MacBook Air keyboards. They did not do a good job at all with those type of keyboards, and that was probably the biggest problem with this type of MacBook over the other ones. So that in and of itself is kind of another problem, I would say, with those newer type of MacBooks. They've since fixed it, but that was a really big annoyance in my opinion. But with this type of MacBook, you had that, standard keyboard, which looked beautiful. You also have that trackpad at the bottom, which was a button click. There was no, vibration motor that was sensing it. So that honestly wasn't really a crazy big deal in my opinion either. And that kind of covered it up in terms of that. Now, in terms of power, this is another side of this MacBook. You can always spec it out. The 15-inch ones were a little bit more powerful than these MacBooks, but the problem with this type of MacBook nowadays is the performance. It's really not that great of a performing MacBook anymore, and that's kind of what the disadvantage is with these type of MacBooks. Now, I will say it's not a slow performing MacBook. If you're trying to go ahead and try to use this thing on an everyday basis, and you're not really doing anything crazy with your device, then it's really not going to be that big of a deal, I think. I think it's going to be perfectly fine, and realistically, whatever you do with your device, you're probably going to have a decent experience with this type of MacBook. But the problem is when it starts going up a notch, when you actually start utilizing this MacBook for maybe video editing, higher end video editing, maybe you want to go ahead and start, actually gaming on your MacBook or anything like that. And this type of MacBook nowadays is a little bit dated, especially when compared to the M1, M2, and M1 Pro and M1 Max chipsets that we have nowadays. So that is also a little bit of a disadvantage. I don't think it's like a deal breaker or anything, but that is one thing that has constantly kind of changed in the landscape of MacBooks. They were notoriously not being like the most powerful, devices of all time, but since then they've actually changed up and they've been very, very powerful. So it really depends on how you look at it. I think you could still use this MacBook every day if you're not a power user, but if you are, that's kind of an issue. But also another big thing is that this device has pretty much since been outdated. This thing hasn't gotten an update. It's gotten security updates, I believe, but it hasn't gotten a full OS update in a very long time because it's unsupported. In fact, the 2016 MacBook Pros are now unsupported as well. So this is a pretty big change, for recent times. Apple discontinued a ton of different MacBooks, and this one being one of them, I think 2-3 OS versions ago. So I say that to say the 2013 MacBook Pro, I think is very interesting right now. It's very cheap, so you can buy this thing for a couple $100s. It's not a super, expensive MacBook, and it still feels very premium, and it still performs fairly decently. But I do think if you want to get a MacBook that's going to last you for a little bit of time, maybe a little bit longer, going with the M1 MacBooks that Apple has made, you can't go wrong with them. Apple did a tremendous job, and I can't stop, saying so many good things about them. That is definitely the route I would recommend going. But with this MacBook, I think it's good. I think it was really good when it first came out, but now I probably wouldn't recommend buying it if you can go and afford the M1 MacBook Airs or any of the M1 models that Apple has made. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.